Silent Hill: The Short Message represents the rebirth of the Silent Hill franchise, and what a rough roller coaster of a rebirth it is. Overall, this game has some good things going for it, but in my opinion it has a lot more going against it, and I think this is going to get absolutely, and somewhat undeservedly, bashed and demolished by most people for a lot of short-sighted reasons. That's not to say that the game doesn't warrant harsh criticism. In fact, it definitely deserves it in some areas. It's just a shame because I think there's some worthwhile pieces. It's just hidden underneath a thick layer of poor execution and poor design. I hope that the new teams at Konami can take the best parts of this experiment, learn from it, and eventually run with it. In a blog post from producer Motoi Okamoto on PlayStation Blog, he says this: "This game started as something like an experimental project, an opportunity for us to try out different things, see what worked and what didn't, and grow and polish our horror game expertise. We also had a lot of people who were relatively new in their career, but still loved Silent Hill, and who really wanted to be involved in making a horror game, so we used this as a way for our team to build hands-on experience too." This quote is the reason why I called the game an experiment in my video title, and the first way it shows this is in the game's length. It's called The Short Message for a reason, clocking in at just under 2 hours long, and completely free to download. This is a bold strategy to market your franchise, but I think Konami wanted to replicate the success of the now extinct PT and the first Resident Evil 7 demo, as well as reintroduce Silent Hill in a way that would make a big splash. This is going to be nowhere near as big as PT or the RE7 demo, but I honestly think that there are some worthwhile things hidden in here. But there's also plenty of things that might turn off potential new fans to this franchise. And coming from someone whose first experience with Silent Hill is a short message, it doesn't do enough for me to be excited for the next game in the series. But it does do enough for me to want another. Just better. Enough with the mixed feelings though, let's dive right into what makes this return both a success story and a failure. Surprisingly, the problems of this experiment are not as surface level as they seem. You can take a glance at it and critique a few things that stand out, like facial animations being a bit off or some graphical oversights being present. You can even look at the story missing the mark and easily dismiss it. You can look at the walking sections and call it boring. You can look at the chase sections and call them tedious. All these things are true to an extent, but I don't think any of these criticisms are in good faith, because by criticizing each of these areas, you have to willingly ignore what makes this experiment worthwhile. Or I guess more accurately, not a complete waste of time, because worthwhile is a strong word here. First, let's talk about the story. The story of this game fails in a few major areas, but one area specifically sinks almost everything around it: subtlety. For better or for worse, this story has some extremely heavy themes. I'm talking about abuse and self-harm heavy. There's even multiple warnings that pop up on the screen throughout the game that supplies phone numbers for help. The story focuses on 3 girls and details the effects of bullying and jealousy, as well as how that affects their relationships in an era where mental health and self-esteem can be tied to others' opinions of you on the internet. It also takes a sharp turn into family trauma and ends its roundabout journey by exploring themes of guilt. And while the message is generally a positive one, it's so heavy-handed that it can bring the horror around it down a few notches. The dialogue feels like you're getting a brick shoved down your throat, and the worst part about it is that the brick doesn't even taste very good. For example, our character will constantly make one-note remarks about how they feel about other characters, and the consequence of this is turning low self-esteem into a personality trait.
Too hard on myself, huh? Amelie's the only one who thinks that.
There's just not enough substance here to feel invested in the main character, or any of our 3 characters. That's a must for a story, especially if it involves difficult themes that the game tries to address. But it fails here, and in the end, it's a character-focused story without anything present that makes these characters likable or enjoyable. On top of one-note characters, the game deals with situations and topics that are so messed up, they border on just sad and sickening rather than scary. Don't hear me wrong, I often feel like terror and sadness can be intertwined effectively. Heartbreaking scenarios are cliché in horror for a reason. They're almost perfect ground for your story. But here it comes off just wrong. I'm trying to avoid specific details since I don't want to touch anything or show anything that YouTube might be unhappy with. But if you decide to play the short experiment, you will most likely come to the same conclusion, that it has nothing interesting to say about its subject matter. Its main message can be boiled down to be kind to others and reach out to those in need, which isn't a bad message at all. It's just a message that has been done a billion times. And with how the message is presented and executed, it feels like it has as much depth as a nursery rhyme, which isn't good. It doesn't help that every twist and turn of the actual plot that delivers this message is only half interesting. Most of the plot is about unraveling the mystery of what happened to Maya and why she decides to do what she did. Unfortunately, these reveals fall flat because it relies on caring about our main character. And since the game already fails at doing that, the story told here is way less effective and interesting than it could have been. The twists and the story beats the game presents aren't bad in themselves. They just fail here because they're surrounded by so much other bad that the actual plot can't carry the full weight of the game. It's almost crazy what bad dialogue and poor execution can do in any media piece ever. What's more is that some of the cinematic direction of this game baffles me. The biggest offender is the switching between the third person and the first person perspective. Every cutscene in this game is third person, while most of the horror happens in first person. This creates an odd dynamic where it feels like you're being taken out of the horror when you enter a cutscene. This is because almost every single weird and trippy supernatural thing that happens is in first person, while the cutscenes usually focus on our main character's face. To avoid this weird feeling of stopping and starting, every in-game cutscene should have been in first person, except for maybe the first. In my opinion, as a player, this would make the experience flow better and make the end product more cohesive. I say this mostly because the switch to the live action cutscenes that sometimes happens are way less jarring, because they remain in the first person, and you can argue that going from animated to live action is a much starker change than first to third person. I think that psychological horror works better in the first person anyways, but that's just me. Overall, the main idea here is that if the best message in the world is wrapped up in one-note characters, an uninteresting storyline, and it's presented and executed poorly, it's going to feel like it sucks. And that's exactly what happened here. This game would have been better if every cutscene was removed. Now that I hear myself say that, it sounds pretty harsh, but sometimes less is more, and the game needed more of the moments where it succeeded rather than failed. This leads us to the game's biggest narrative strengths. Now, so far I've talked harshly about what I'll call the game's macro story, its overarching narrative that it gives through cutscenes and dialogue. Let's talk about the micro story. These are the little moments of terrifying imagery that tell more of a story than any cutscene could, because where the game succeeds and why boils down to these moments where it executes and presents its horror effectively. I understand this sounds like the bare minimum, and that's because it is, but I have to say it because I think people are going to overlook how well this game actually does this. When you're walking through the halls of this abandoned apartment building and maybe a school, there is some seriously terrifying imagery. One of my favorites has to do with walking down a corridor where words start to appear. They then are swallowed in a spiral when walking down the hallway. But for every one of these moments, there's also a moment where that terrifying and well done imagery is interrupted and ruined by the story barging back in and inserting itself. There's a moment in a cutscene where you find your own dead body, and I can't help but wonder how much more effective this might have been if we found the body ourselves outside of a cutscene. It just goes to show that if the game would stick to this effective imagery without any of the interruptions, it would have been a much more enjoyable experience. My favorite moments were ones that have nothing to do with any of the voice acting or scripted cutscenes. The most memorable of them all comes during a running sequence where you are surrounded by a bunch of blinking eyes as you're being chased by a monster. This is not only the most terrifying moment of the demo, it's one of the most terrifying moments, for me, in any horror video game ever. This is horror done effectively, not this.
Why won't she reply? Where are you? Am I going crazy?
The easy to pick on story is not the only piece of this puzzle though. The gameplay here is just as flawed. It's a shame because to a horror game, gameplay is much more important than a good story. If I were to sum up my gameplay critiques in one idea, it's that the game is way too simple and linear. I'm not talking about the absence of multiple endings or choices in a story, I'm talking about what to do and where to go, how the game functions on a fundamental level. For most of the game, it'll give you small rooms and tight corridors in succession to explore and advance the story. At first, I liked having small corridors and haunting rooms to revisit multiple times, but the game doesn't do much with this, because almost every room you visit has a very specific set of actions you are funneled towards almost obviously. It's almost lacking as much subtlety as the story. When you aren't doing this, you'll be chased by a flower monster where you'll have to choose which door to go through. At times there'll even be a sequence of these that you'll have to go through in order, or else you'll just keep looping over and over again. Part of the brilliance of horror games is how the atmosphere and the gameplay moments can strengthen each other. Part of being immersed in the game world and what makes it so scary involves looking around and experimenting with objects around the room. Exploring means progressing forward. This doesn't happen very often in this game. In fact, it feels like the game will move you forward itself. All you have to do is walk up and press X on a few documents. The exceptions to these are extremely rare and come in the form of the aforementioned chase sequences or the very rare puzzle. In fact, can you guess how many puzzles there are in this 2-hour game? 2, and I'm being very generous with counting one of them. and those two puzzles were the strongest parts of the entire game. There are numbers painted across a school hallway, and you have to find them, match them to an image by color to get the correct order, and then input this code into a lock. This is something that would be found in a side room in a Resident Evil game for a bonus healing item or treasure. Despite this game desperately needed more of these puzzles. I want to be careful with my comparisons. Silent Hill should set itself apart from Resident Evil, but I think it's missing so many key elements to make the game, well, a game, that a copycat in some areas would be better than absolutely nothing. But despite it being so basic and almost barbaric, it was a highlight because I actually had to use my brain to progress forward. The second puzzle is a final chase sequence. At this point in the game, they have gotten a bit tiresome, with them just about reaching their limit of fun and usefulness. But I thought this last one was the most engaging part of the game, and I have to say I genuinely really like this part. You have to run around and grab a dozen photographs while you are being chased. It's extremely simple, but the maze-like layout made it more difficult than I was expecting. There are some frustrating mechanics, like how the monster can sometimes randomly and instantly spawn in front of you. But the best part about this was that I learned the layout through trial and error. There was a method to the madness, and I was only able to succeed in the end because I started to figure out where I was going. I learned this maze, and I can tell you which numbered doors led to where and which rooms were connected. Without the convenience of a map, I was left to my own navigation skills, and it made it one of the most engaging traversal experiences I have had in a while. I find it funny that this happened in a horror game that was free. To inconvenience me like this was a bit shocking, but I look on it fondly. Just imagine this concept on a grander scale. Imagine if you had a much bigger maze with more and different things to collect, with more creative ways to avoid the monster. It could be an entire game. That could not only be terrifying, but unique as well. Overall, I struggle to recommend Silent Hill: The Short Message to almost anyone. If the game was meant to be spread by word of mouth and build hype that Silent Hill is back, then in that aspect the game has failed. But if this is just a short experiment to gain feedback and gain experience for the next big game, then Silent Hill: A Short Message was worth Konami's resources, time, and money. If they would have put a full game out with this kind of story, style, and presentation, I guarantee you that it would somehow get an even worse reception than this game is getting. I doubt that for multiple reasons any of the young team members that were so eager to make this game will ever hear this. But I want to say it anyways. This game isn't a complete disaster. There are things that impress me, and I hope that for the next Silent Hill game, things are going to be more fun, more thought-provoking, and most importantly, even scarier. If not, then the next game's most prominent and memorable aspect will be a complete and utter flop of a well-regarded yet wildly inaccessible franchise that has been ignored and left to rot for far too long. And honestly, that might be the scariest thing of all. Thanks for watching. To inconvenience me like this was a shit. Whoops. Sorry.